Hello, and welcome to the Homebody Podcast. This episode marks our return to our regular publishing schedule. For the past 3 months, we've been taking a break from weekly episodes, which I'll share more about in some upcoming content, but we're really happy to be back. And with this return, we're also trying on some new formats, particularly for the forecast episodes, which come out at the beginning of each month or at the end of the month before. So the Astro Forecast episodes will continue to be one episode a month, and now we'll also be inviting a guest each month to co-host so that we hear more voices, we get more varied perspectives, meet some new faces, and also just have more fun while diving into the astrology for each upcoming month. So I'm really excited about this new format and already really enjoying it so much. So our first guest for this new format is Pao Rodelas. Pao is an astrologer who recently moved to Queens, New York from Hawaii. She practices traditional astrology with a focus on natal astrology, solar returns, electional, and horary. She co-hosts 2 astrology podcasts, the Fixed Astrology Podcast and also Pinay Astrology. Her big 3 are Leo Sun, Taurus Moon, and Taurus Rising. And Pao is also a competitive power lifter, a community organizer, and a communications director. So you can find all of her links below, her Twitter, Instagram, TikTok with the @Pao Astrology for more content on astrology, cats, worker organizing, and so much more. And also check out her website at paoastrology.com. All of the links below in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. We had a lot of fun doing this episode for you. So if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to leave us a comment, whether you're listening or watching, subscribe to the show, and or share with a friend that you think would enjoy it also. And last but not least, if you'd like a companion for this month's astrology, check out our cosmic calendar, which is a done-for-you Notion database that's updated every month. And it includes all the transits that we talk about on the podcast today, and also some that we didn't within it. And each transit includes a summary, journal prompts to dive in further, as well as space for your own notes so that you can keep track of how these transits show up for you personally and just start to build a really super helpful archive, something that's very functional, searchable, and organized, all for your favorite astro data. Pao actually mentions tracking transits in this episode, something that, in this, basically the cosmic calendar makes it easy for you to do that, something that's very searchable and organized so that you have a very personal astro database over time. And this creation helps you do that. So you can check out the cosmic calendar in the link below. You can subscribe to get yours for this upcoming month and the months to come. You can subscribe for the next 3 months, the next 6 months, or the next 12 months, and you can also cancel at any time. So be sure to check the show notes below for more about our guest and also the links mentioned in the episode. And with that, let's get into this August forecast. All righty. Well, I always like to kick off guest episodes by letting the guests sort of introduce themselves in a way that's like, how would you like us to know you today as we move into this material together? Would you mind kind of kicking off our August forecast by letting our listeners know who you are today and how you'd like us to know you?
Sure. And thanks again, Mary Grace, for having me as a guest on this podcast. So my name is Pao. I'm mostly known on astrology Twitter as Pao Astrology. And, my big 3 are Leo, Taurus, Taurus. That's Leo Sun, Taurus Moon, Taurus Rising. And I'm an astrologer. I mostly focus on traditional astrology, Hellenistic astrology. I don't do readings anymore. They're closed indefinitely just due to some big life changes. I used to be based in Hawaii and I'm now in New York City. So that's been a big thing for me. But when I used to do readings, and if I do kick them back up again, I focused on natal astrology, but also solar return charts, horary astrology, and then electional. So yeah, I think that's a pretty basic introduction of myself.
I love all of that. I'm also a Taurus moon, so I can, the only stable thing in my chart.
Is the moon still in Taurus right now? I think so.
It might be at the tail end. I didn't check this morning, which I normally do. It's either at the very tail end or it's just moved into Gemini. I'm not sure. Either way, I love that coincidentally for us, or synchronously for us. So I feel like we're jumping into August at a sort of like this cliffhanger moment. I feel like July left us like hanging from the cliff with like 2 fingers at the top, and we're all like, what's gonna happen? And I feel like that's sort of how we come into August. How are you feeling as we like dive into August month astrology?
I 100% agree with that. I do, for anyone listening, if you're wondering what August will be like, really reflect back on July, but especially the last part of July when that new moon in Leo happens on July 28th. There was so much in July around, like, you had Mars and enter Taurus, and then there's Saturn still in Aquarius, and Uranus and the North Node are also in Taurus. So it's this like Uranian energy from July is gonna peak in August. So yeah, definitely look back at what July was like if you want a taste of what August will be like.
Agreed. Yeah, it's sort of like this peaking energy or culminating. I imagine like Mars and Taurus kind of like packing their bags, and like maybe Mars doesn't normally pack bags, but in Taurus they do. And then we get to find out what's in that bag when we jump into August, which starting off, I guess the first thing we're going to talk about is August 1st, where we have Mars conjoining the North Node. And then very quickly after that, Mars conjoining Uranus. And ooh, this feels a little explosive to me. I'm interested in your thoughts. Why don't you share what you are thinking about these conjunctions that kind of bring us in with a bang, I think.
I agree. As we said, this was already starting in July because Mars had entered Taurus in July. And, for folks who keep really good notes or journal or whatever, like I do, you can look back at this same Saturn Uranus square happened 3 times in 2021. It happened in February, June, and December. And even when you zoom out and really look at just a worldly level of what had happened throughout 2021 and what was already happening in July 2021, the common denominators were one, just a lot of disruption around just like world leaders. So unfortunately, assassinations or coup attempts or changes in leadership. We already saw a lot of that in July with the unfortunate assassination of the former Japanese prime minister, but also Boris Johnson's recent resignation as prime minister of the UK. So that's how, and then, on top of that, 2021 and July 2021 also just had like more stuff around COVID. And, like there was just a recent news that Joe Biden has tested positive for COVID. So those are also just upcoming themes. On the more positive, or, I don't like using positive and negative, but I mean, for lack of a better phrase, on the other side of it, there is, I think Uranus also brings a lot of innovation and trying new things. And so one thing I was noticing in 2021 in world events that came up again this month is there's a lot of stuff around space exploration. And so this past month in July, we got those like the best yet images of the universe, right? With using infrared technology from the Webb telescope. And so a lot of that was happening in 2021. So sorry, but going back to August, that's what I imagine is I think we're going to see even more of this, and it's gonna happen in that early part of August as these aspects become closer. And then I know we'll get to it in a bit, but it's gonna peak with the full moon in Aquarius.
Yeah, that full moon is looking really a lot. Mucho, a lot. Yeah, I think I agree with all the things that you're saying. Some of the things that feel like, of course, with Uranus and Taurus, I have this sense of always kind of like earthquakey energy where like the ground is quaking underneath our feet, and sometimes it needs to. Sometimes we need to move things around, and the ground is not really likely to move around unless there's some kind of quake. And we're even talking about space exploration and things like that. They're very loud. They disrupt, the ground. They make these loud, like rumbling noises, and you feel things sort of quaking underneath you. And I think adding Mars is this kind of like incisive, divisive, potentially energy, maybe this like separation mixed with that quaky nature of Uranus. It's like a lot of effort put forth towards like overturning or upsetting or in the name, like you said, of like things that have yet to be explored, or really like bold, daring adventures such as space exploration. And as usual, I imagine we'll see a lot of things on both ends of that spectrum and a lot of things in between as well. Mars Uranus feels very accident prone as well, like oops, didn't see that coming. And so like taking extra measures of like care and preparedness and caution, and while there may be a lot of impulse towards like, let's blow it up now, like, there's just like a lot of after effects or aftershocks maybe could be unforeseen. There could be some surprise natures hiding behind these things that feel impulsively apt for that moment, and just to be aware of that, and that sometimes explosive prone moments are not the best moment to do explosive pro things, or maybe they are.
I think even what you were saying on earthquake, it made me think of just the other pattern I was seeing was just, natural disasters or things going on in nature. And I think August is going to be like this heat wave is going to continue, especially now that like everything's moved into Leo. It's just going to be, I don't know what it is like where you're at, but here in New York City, as well as like I have friends in other cities, I'm melting out here.
Yeah. I live in Atlanta and they call it Hotlanta for a reason. So
yeah, but yeah, I think maybe just a way to summarize this, whether you're looking globally or just on a very personal level, like as you said, I think, yeah, there is going to be unrest, tension, erraticism, maybe even just accident prone behavior. But I think there's also a chance for just problem solving, facing challenges, innovation.
Yeah, like busting through something that may be previous, like sometimes the only way to get through is to like bust through, and it may be messy, but this energy could definitely help with that if you're like me and that's not your natural tendency. So I guess our next thing that we would bring up is Mercury is going to enter Virgo on August 4th, which is something that I'm personally excited about. I personally benefit a lot from Virgo energy and just having some mercurial boosts. So I'm looking forward to that. And Mercury is exalted in Virgo and also the ruler of Virgo. So it feels like, I'm looking forward to being able to really get on. I feel like Mercury energy that's strong. It just helps me get on top of some things and feel efficient and like, check, check, check. I did it. And like really I'm proud of things that I normally have a hard time staying on top with. So how are you feeling about Mercury entering Virgo? I'm also excited that Mercury is entering before Mars kind of gets involved in the mutable signs. We get that, which I'm excited about.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I do think this is going to be a really nice light in maybe some of the heavier, more tumultuous transits. As you said, Mercury is really strong in Virgo, and up until that, like as you mentioned, up until Mars enters Gemini on August 20th, we have Mercury will be the only planet in a mutable sign. And so it's like almost like a little bit of like this oasis in the astrology of August. And that means it won't be squaring or opposing anything. It's going to be trining both Mars and Uranus and Taurus, as well as sextiling Venus and Cancer. So as you said, I think this is like really good transit for mastery, honing in on details.
Oh yeah.
Trying to reflect and recharge so that you can gain new insights. People have to remember too, like Virgo is, one of the phrases is like it's an introverted sign, right? Because it's an earth sign. And I think this Mercury can also bring some of that flexibility and that shifting gears, because even as you had mentioned earlier, when we're talking about that Mars, Saturn, Uranus, like sometimes you just need to kind of bust down a wall. And I feel like that Mercury can really help with the cleanup after.
Totally. I agree with that. Like the logistics of cleaning up, or even like the logistics of breaking through. Like you said, they're trining those planets in Taurus right now. So maybe potentially having some logistical assistance with that. And
right.
Yeah, I'm excited
to break down a wall, right? You have to actually
we have to make some calculations. We need to be smart about this.
Exactly.
I love that because Mercury's been like, we had the Mercury retrograde and then Mercury moved into Cancer where they're just kind of like quiet and they were like, behind the beams for a long time. And in Leo, they're getting like squeezed through the Saturn Uranus mode. And here I feel like Mercury's really like, they're moving fast and they're energized and they're quick and they're visible, kind of all the things they like to be. So very enabled and very capable in helping us with those logistics. So it also makes me think that there will be, while there's other sort of like peaking tensions happening in either other areas of life or in sort of other astro zones, I think that it makes me think that we might use this Mercury and Virgo energy as sort of like a coping mechanism. It's like, I don't know what to do, but at least I can like be productive over here or optimize the situation, or at least I can organize this mess, or I can sort of carry on amidst other things that feel more heated and uncomfortable.
Right. Like if I like hone in those areas of your life where you can really get into that flow state. I think that's what I think of with this Mercury and Virgo.
Totally. It feels charged. And I have a lot of Virgo people, Sun in Virgo, Moon in Virgo people in my life. And yet watching them in that zone is like, they're willing to put forth the effort until it's right, until it's just right. And that movement, that flexibility is usually adapting around whatever it takes to get it just right, like mastery, like you said. So
love it.
So mastery is coping in early August. And then Sunday, August 7th, we have Mars squaring Saturn. Mars and Taurus being really happy. And then Saturn in Aquarius, who is retrograde, but also very strong in Aquarius. So how are you thinking about this Mars square Saturn moment?
I think, with the Mars square Saturn, when we're talking about, Mars, and I'm not going to take credit for this phrasing, but Austin Coppock on the Astrology podcast, like I just remember hearing him a lot in 2020 when the Mars Saturn square was happening, but in different signs. It was in Aries and Capricorn respectively. He described Mars as the gas and Saturn as the brakes. And that still applies in this context, even if it's like the planets are in completely different signs. So, even this conversation we're having about like breaking down walls, this is where it really kind of peaks. It's almost like it makes me think of like that moment in a siege, right? Where like just imagine like a besieged city and there's like an army outside just like really trying to like that Mars and Taurus is like that army outside that's just really trying to patiently almost like starve out that city. But yeah, there might also just be like moment where you said like it's like, no, I think now is the time to really kind of bust through that wall. So
totally. Whereas like thinking about like Mars and Aries square Saturn, which we had a few years ago, is more of like I'm just going to bust through it really fast and maybe like throw fire overboard. It feels like that Mars and Taurus is more like we have the really heavy ass like rocks. What are those things? Are they catapults? And they just like chuck them. Like that's the Mars and Taurus. It's gonna slow. Takes a lot of investment to get that one thing situated to blow, but it's like it's there for sure.
Yeah, I really like that analogy. That really fits with that. But yeah, I think it's just adding the fuel, I guess, to what we already discussed. Like this Mars, like Saturn, Uranus, like has been building up since July, and now it's just really going exact with this transit.
Totally. And, it's like that, like scampering up walls, attempting to topple like fixed entrenched structures or figures or systems. But Mars is a little ill-equipped to do that in Taurus. Like they have these kind of slow, heavy, burdensome things that they're attempting to do that with. But Mars, not super well placed in Taurus is definitely not as much of a formidable foe, I think, against Saturn in this particular go around. Though they may have a lot of like desire and strength and maybe like stubbornness, I think, with both of them in that fixed signs. It feels like it gets like drawn out. It takes a long time to kind of come to a conclusion or a resolution or to know who won, because they're both unwilling to move in their own way. And Mars just exerting a lot of effort, doing a lot of heavy lifting, but Saturn is like this thumb that just keeps like pushing down. And yeah, I feel like Mars's outcomes are not positioned to be super successful this go around.
I agree. This transit happened in January 2021. So, on a global scale, that's when the January 6th Capitol riots had happened. But, for folks listening, definitely look back at January 2021 to see if themes recur, especially with like Saturn's retrograde, as you had mentioned earlier. So that's like Saturn. I agree with you. Saturn is in a much stronger position than Mars in this case. But it's a retrograde Saturn. So Saturn does have, it's not like the strongest opponent either.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it feels like it promises to be very like drawn out and like stubborn and like, can we just wrap this up? And like neither of them are doing that or wanting to do that.
Yeah.
And then we move on to that full moon in Aquarius on August 11th. And this is such a it's such a big day. So much is happening on this day that it feels a little bit hard for me anyways, looking at it to really look at the full moon in Aquarius by itself, because it's really like encompassing so many other things. I don't know how you feel about it. What are your thoughts?
It's personally hard for me to look at because my birthday is 3 days after. So I get all of this in my solar return chart, and I'm just
in.
I really should get a reading from someone else just to get like an objective viewpoint on it, how it hits me. And the thing too is like this full moon is at 19 degrees of Leo in Aquarius, which is very close to where my natal sun is. But anyway, to your question, yeah, there is a lot going on. This full moon is like it's exactly squaring both the nodes and Uranus and Taurus. And then on the same day, Venus enters Leo. And so Venus is now joining this, I don't want to call it a party, but more like
a sarcastic party.
this like battle that's been happening between Mars, Saturn, and Uranus. So now Venus is there. And Venus is like the planet of peace, right? She's not, I don't think she's, and she doesn't really have any dignity in Leo. And so when it comes to these Venusian things like relationships, creativity, love, it's not going to be the easiest time for those things. That's one thing that kind of comes into mind, is just how Venus plays into here. I would say the other thing too is just everything we've already been talking about with the Mars, Saturn, Uranus, T-square. All of that, I think, really, really peaks with this full moon. Full moons are already about peaks in general, but I think this one absolutely is that. And so whatever has been building up for you or globally since July, like, I think it's really gonna jump out during this time.
Yeah, it gets really illuminated. I think that it's like, if you had any doubts as to what was going on, like now all the lights are on and we're like, oh, that's what's going on. And it's really, yeah, Venus entering Leo, it's sort of like I think in just a very blank slate Venus in Leo, it's like she wants to like warm the heart and like, take pleasure in the things that, are unique and individual and charismatic and luxurious, and like what makes you stand out from the crowd, wear that lipstick or whatever. And I feels like it in Leo this time around, if there's a damper on that, it gets doused or distracted or sort of squeezed in a really big way. And at the same time that the sun is also squaring Uranus. So we have, again, I feel like there's a lot of like, there will be a lot of themes around like independence, because the sun in Leo is so like that courageous, autonomous individual, that like not loyal, what is the word? Vigorous kind of vitality of the self. And like, I feel like Uranus, while not necessarily about anything pertaining to the individual, it has that sort of preference for that which is like independent and free and more free, and those squaring off with each other. Again, it does feel accident prone, but I do think it also, like the sun being in its own sign and being relatively well positioned here, like finding courage or tapping into your own sense of resilience, even in the midst of things that are surprising or trying or upsetting, and really giving someone the courage to either add calls for liberation for things that you care about, or to stand strong in your own sense of self, or whatever rebellions or originality or things that's asking for. And the moon is just sort of like collecting it all up and like holding it up for all of us to see.
I completely agree with you. Even as you said the word originality, that was the word that popped up right in that moment as well. And then you said it, and I was like, okay, bingo. Like, I do think that there is a lot of potential for creative freedom and even maybe some natural spontaneity with this transit. But yeah, so there, I think sometimes like some of the most like creative expression comes out of a place where you are feeling challenges or boundaries, or you're hitting walls. And it's oftentimes those moments where we do have to think the most creatively to like really bust out of that. And so I think there's a potential for a good mix of those things. But yes, also, just the impulsivity and possibly the accidents, and unpredictability is just like another word associated with Uranus too. So, just like look out for those things. But yeah.
And it could be that nice sprinkle to like, how am I going to stand more resiliently in my own creative voice or identity or whatever. And it could be something that catches us off guard and makes us have to like tap into that or find it in some way. I agree with all of that. And yeah, Leo's Venus entering Leo is just kind of joining the party, and she'll kind of get to go through her own more personal squeeze towards the end of the month.
Yeah, I think, on that squeeze for folks, just think, when you think about Venus, just think about, definitely relationships. That's both romantic and platonic. That's any kind of just interpersonal relationship, any kind of creative endeavors, appearance as well. Like, I'm very, especially for people who have this, like, especially like angular in their charts, like seeing what people might go through when it comes to like, maybe it's like, oh, I want to like do a complete makeover, but then you're like, I don't know, like I kind of want to, that tension,
mix it up.
yeah, that fear of like wanting to mix it up, also that fear of just like the no or the unknown.
Yeah, like, will I love it 2 weeks from now? I don't know.
Yeah.
So for sure. I think next up we have Sunday, August 14th. We have the sun is going to oppose Saturn, which is their kind of last big aspect before they change signs as well. And I think of, again, the sun in Leo is this sort of like very regal, kingly figure standing for like the booming of life, kind of facing down Saturn, which is just like this big no. And it's like Saturn, who is like cold, and that distance and that no is sort of like facing off the burning heart, or like the warmth of the burning heart a little bit. And we're having to kind of choose between this, or make a decision around how we integrate or how we move forward around these, like Saturn, the sun in Leo's tendency towards like that optimism and that hope and that resilience, and Saturn just at the very least more grumpy in nature or indifferent to being heavy. It's like, yeah, it's hard, I don't care. And the sun is like, I'm burn brightly and strong and resilient anyways. So I feel like these two facing each other off, like there's like a forced decision or integration that's gonna be begged.
Yeah. The August 14th is my birthday, so I get this.
Okay.
But this is like, not only is this transit happening, but it's like the sun is right on top of my natal sun, which means that Saturn's directly opposing it.
Yeah, it's just
So
nailing you.
You and everyone feel free to follow me on Twitter to see my live updates on how I'm handling this.
How that's going.
But I wanted, so there's another astrologer on Astrology Twitter. His name is SJ Anderson. He also has a YouTube channel, but he, right before, as I was preparing for this podcast episode, he pointed out that this is going to be the last Leo season where Saturn is going to be in Aquarius until 2050. And then this transit goes exact, as you said, on August 14. So, it's, both of these planets are in their domiciles, which I think really highlights like the archetype of the sun and Saturn, and then also the archetype of like, what is that difference between Leo versus Aquarius? Like oftentimes when you hear those two, the difference between Leo and Aquarius, you often hear about individuality versus like the collective good or the greater good. I think that is one way to look at it. The other thing I find very interesting about the sun and Saturn like opposing one another is, both planets very much have to deal with the concept of time. And, it's Saturn being the slowest moving planet. We often think of time as in, when you think about Saturn, you think about very, very slow moving time, or about things needing to take time. And that's why you have to have discipline and you need to have patience. And whereas the sun is a timekeeper too. Like, I mean, since humans have been around, we've looked at the sun as a way to be able to measure time, but on a more literally a day-to-day basis, like on a more short-term basis, but also the seasons too, right? We're talking, when we talk about Leo season, Virgo season, and so on, this is all due to the sun's movements and the consistency of the sun, like the moon, they never go retrograde. So we know like these seasons more or less kind of stay the same. So I do wonder what could potentially kind of come up to around just the concept of time for people, like living in the moment versus, just some of the longer legacy stuff. I could see that coming up too.
Totally. I'm remembering this poem, and the name of the poet is really, what's his name? Jimmy Schuyler, and things take the time they take. And thinking about that as you were talking, it's like, yeah, these different ways of moving through the world, and one that just it tends us more towards like asking more demands, where the sun has a more, has a more weathery approach to time. Like we can move with it and we have more stamina for that time, I think. Whereas the stamina of Saturn, it always just, it feels like to me anyways, it's always asking for more than what we want or have to give.
Yeah. And I think some of the reason why we get more of that with the sun is that, because both deal with time, there is also there's death, and like the idea of death behind both planets as well. But with the sun, there's also like the rebirth is more attached with that, right? Because it's like, the sun sets, then we're in night, and then we know that there's another day. And so I think that's where some of the optimism that comes with the sun is there, because there's always, tomorrow's a new day. There's always going to be like new days.
Totally. There's like that like innate optimism or hopefulness, or that we can like just know that like, oh, we can do again better tomorrow.
Right.
Yeah. And then we get to what I think is sort of like a big topic for this month. On Saturday, August 20th, Mars enters Gemini. At least it's August 20th where I live. I think potentially, no, I think Pacific Coast will be just barely August 20th as well. But Mars enters Gemini, which is the beginning of like a long story. Mars is going to be in Gemini until 2023, whereas Mars normally spends about 2-ish months per sign, more or less, depending on when it's happening. Mars is going to be in Gemini for 7 months because there will be a Mars retrograde. And so I think they'll be there until like the end of March 2023. And so I feel like this is, I guess, a red flag to be like, check your Gemini house, right? Like these planets in mutable signs, such as like Pisces, Gemini, Sagittarius, Virgo, are now going to be interacting with Mars for a really long time. And now planets that move through these signs are going to have to deal with that kind of that agitation. And what I feel like when Mars goes retrograde, it starts to generate some kind of like aggravation is a word that kept coming to mind. But before I get too much into it, how are you feeling about Mars and Gemini? What's standing out for you?
Yeah, I wanted to point out too, the last time Mars was retrograde in Gemini was like literally New Year's Eve of 2007 up until March 2008. But the retrograde actually had started in Cancer during that time, and then moved back into Gemini. And so for folks again who want to just kind of look back and reflect, like that was the last time we got this transit. I have a lot of thoughts. First, this is a Mars return for the United States.
Yeah.
The US has Mars and Gemini, so that's kind of funny. And you could do a whole dive in that in and of itself. I think for now, actually, like before the retrograde starts, so the retrograde doesn't start until October 30th. So we get like this couple of months until then. I do think this Mars and Gemini could be a nice change of pace, just because it had just been in its detriment in Taurus. And again, this is all the stuff we were just talking about, just having this like face off with both Saturn and Uranus. Now, Mars doesn't have any dignity in Gemini, but it's still like a little bit of a level up coming out of Taurus. It doesn't have any like square, well, I guess it's squaring Mercury, which I'll talk about in a bit. But I think Mars and Gemini can still be like a little bit of like just doing too much. On one hand, like I do think this could be still the time to like look around and find out. And this Mars is going to be like sextiling Jupiter in Aries. So I almost think like, yeah, like warn people, but at the same time, I don't think there's only so much a warning can do. I think this transit could still very much be like, people will still do what they want to do. Just keep in mind, it's probably going to come back again. Maybe try new things, but just also be open-minded to the possibility that has to get revisited anyway once this retrograde happens.
Yeah, totally. Because it isn't Gemini, right? This mercurial, like, inquisitive, curious, bouncy sign. It's very like highly changing sign. It feels very scattered, like a lot of energy, a lot of action taken in a lot of different directions. It feels, for me personally, like it also could just have like that kind of energy makes me personally anxious. I'm not like predicting that for everyone in the world, but when I start feeling really scattered, I feel like, so I'm anticipating that for myself. And it feels too that when I think maybe Mars gets more activated, especially in the United States, is it will conjoin, the natal US Uranus and also the natal US Mars. That's sort of like machine gun energy. Like I think a lot of things are scattered, like it's not specific energy. And so it can have its own different kind of, it's just a different kind of conflict, I think, or a different kind of action, as opposed to something that is very focused and heavy. And it has like, we have that dual nature of Gemini. combining with Mars, which is something that can be more incisive or divisive. And so really, what were we going to see kind of split into two, or how are we going to be looking at like both sides of things? It feels like it could be potentially very faction oriented. And a lot of like verbal, it's like these mercurial things really getting in the mix, like education and business and language and words and things like that.
Yeah, to add to that, Mercury is still in Virgo and it will now be squaring this and is ruling this Mars. And so, as we said earlier, yeah, like Mercury in Virgo very much can lead to good communication skills, but then it's squaring Mars. And I could see that also being like heated debates and arguments. And, just a word of caution to folks that, just because you're right or have like a really good point also still like, it doesn't necessarily call for, like really like dying on your hill. But at the same time, this energy really is like, I don't know how much like any warning is going to do any good anyway. I think people are still going to do what they want to do.
Yeah, I just think that, I feel like when Mars starts to like struggle, I think, and while the beginning of this transit, Mars is not in retrograde where I feel like it's building frustration, but I feel like Mars just like acts kind of badly. And I think all planets, when they're struggling, they kind of act out more. But we're just in such a like Mars heavy, it'll be so dense and so much Mars, I think, particularly here in the US during this transit, that I think we'll really see some of that frustration kind of coming out in ways that are like, well, that could have been better.
Right. I think the
Yeah.
other thing, because so Mars is lost in Gemini in March 2021, I believe. And I really slept on this last season. So I don't want to make this mistake again, but I tend to forget Neptune is still in Pisces. So both Mars and Mercury are like squaring and opposing this Neptune as well. And I noticed last year that it did lead to just, there is just this like a lot of just like kind of this erratic energy, and it's just kind of going all over the place. And then now imagine like the fog of Neptune just descending all over that. There's just kind of like a possible just obscuring of things as well. So I could also see scenarios where you can really, really fully believe like you're right, and then you like find out, oh wait, no, I didn't know everything or see everything.
Yeah, like dying on the wrong hill for the wrong reason, and just that could happen. With that fog, I think is a very good Neptune word. That's sort of like the cloudiness or the nebulousness, like unsure, which is not very helpful when you like feel obliged to take aim. You don't really want it to be super foggy. You want really like clear vision.
Right. And it's hard because that Mars and Gemini is not one that just kind of like sit and be like, okay, let me just wait for the fog to lift, or like wait for things to clear a little bit. Like, no, I feel I could just see that Mars still wanting to like swing a sword through like the fog.
Totally. I'll just cut through it. Then you're like, oops, what was that? Yeah. So yeah, for sure. It's going to be an interesting one to watch, and we'll have a lot of time to watch it and a lot of time to talk about it on this podcast, because it's going to be coming up a lot over the next 7 months. So, all right. Then the sun enters Virgo. So Monday, August 22nd, the sun moves into Virgo, which is a step down in dignity for the sun. The sun rules Leo, and so has a great deal of dignity there. And then moving into, again, this mercurial sign, this mutable earth sign that kind of shines in the details and efficiency and service and mastery, like you said earlier, like really wants to like get it just right. Perfecting something or having those like measurable results of like tangible progress feels like something that's very a Virgo value. How are you feeling about the sun going into Virgo?
There's another astrologer on Twitter named Kara, whose like screen name is like Moon's Harvest, and I really wanted to quote something that they had tweeted not too long ago, and it was, "What a laugh for creation to give Virgo humility after it gave Leo pride." So there is very much that stereotype too of like that transition from Leo to Virgo. But I agree with you that whether you're looking at the transition of Leo to Virgo, or if you're for the folks who are in, I don't know if you are, but the folks who are into tarot out there, the cards of like the transition from Strength to Hermit, or even looking at the decans of Leo versus the decans of Virgo, I think the common denominator in all of that is that theme of reassessment and self-reflection, of being like, okay, like Leo season was just like me and, individuality and creative expression. And then now is this period of like, oh, what went well? What didn't? Like, what do we do next time?
Totally. It's like there's this kind of like vibrancy of like affirmation in Leo. It's like, you're you, and let's celebrate that at all costs. So like, even if it's like not, and then in the Virgo, it's like, is that actually a good idea? Like, it's not a good idea, actually. Like, if you ever just want your plan shot down, just tell a Virgo about it. They will tell you all the things that can make it better, which is very helpful, but sometimes not what you want to hear. And yeah, I think so. And then now that we have Mars in Gemini, the sun will be entering a sign-based square with Mars very quickly, and then soon be squaring Mars directly. So we'll sort of be getting some of that, some direct feedback about some of what Mars is up to, I think, and how that's going to be affecting those other mutable signs.
Right. Yeah. This really is like, okay, yeah, things are shifting on the mutable signs now, after just having to deal with like most of the month with the fixed signs.
Yeah, for sure. So it'll be interesting to see sort of how that goes. And it will be, I think, less of a, like, when Mercury was entering at the beginning of the month, we had sort of like a little vacation for Mercury, whereas I don't think it might be sort of like heavy tasked cleanup or heavy tasked logistics or something like that. There may be more of like a weightedness to it, I think, now that Mars is there. More things to clean up potentially.
Yeah. Agreed.
And then we have Mercury actually changing signs. So on Thursday, August 25th, Mercury will enter Libra. And I think we should go ahead and point out that Mercury is going to station retrograde in Libra in September. So Mercury, as of this point, is already in their shadow phase. Yeah, I always think of Mercury and Libra as this very, like, they have a monocle and they're very like charming and diplomatic and courteous and organizing the Notion dashboard, but now like making it fashion and making it fair, all of those things together. How are you feeling about Mercury and Libra?
Oh man. So this is a dignity shift for Mercury, because Mercury
sure.
was in its domicile and exaltation in Virgo, but I still think Mercury does well in the air signs. And I agree with you. Like, when I think Mercury in Libra, I'm thinking interpersonal communication, diplomacy, negotiations, and doing it with charm, right? Knowing that you can attract more flies with honey, and creative work as well, because of just, this is a Venus ruled sign. And I think there's overall supportive aspects for Mercury in Libra here, because now it's going to trine Mars instead of like dealing with that square. And so I almost just kind of imagine like Mercury shifts from being this like when dealing with Mars, is arguing with Mars over just like the logistics or just arguing period, to being more in this place of like, okay, how do we compromise? How do we figure things out peacefully? And then it's sextiling all the planets that are still like in Leo. I guess the one opposition it does have is, we still have this Jupiter retrograde in Aries, which we actually really haven't talked much about Jupiter this month. Like this,
We
Jupiter,
haven't, after months of talking about Jupiter.
Exactly. Yeah. This Jupiter for once really taking the backstage in the month of August, but this Mercury now that's in a cardinal sign will be opposing Jupiter. And so even though it's an opposition, I do think there's still like potential for a lot of just maybe like expanding your horizons or your viewpoints, or just having like an overall like positive and optimistic outlook, and or even just kind of helping with just some of that negotiating and that planning and diplomacy. But the one thing I will warn about it, and I think this is like just segueing into the fact that, yeah, this Mercury will station retrograde. And so again, in these periods when the planet is in the sign that it will station retrograde in, but it's not retrograde yet, I always just give caution, because these things will probably get revisited again during the retrograde anyway. And the one thing I could see coming up with this Mercury Jupiter opposition is like taking on or promising more than you can actually like realistically deliver on. And so if that does happen with you, like, it's going to come back during the retrograde, and there's always that time for the renegotiation too. So
Yeah, there might be some sort of like retraction potentially, like with that retrograde, this taking back or going back over. And also something that you kind of hinted at, Mercury and Libra really stepping into this role of like a mediator potentially, and even an advocate. Whereas like Mars and Gemini may be like scattering a lot of energy. Mercury here is sort of like trying to like maybe pull it together a little bit. And I think of Libra a lot of times as initiating relationship, or initiating right relationship or conditions for relationship. And yeah, that mediating role, you mentioned the word compromise a lot. And I think that thinking a lot of like sending a lot of invitations, potentially like inviting a lot of conversation or compromise or coming together that potentially, again, because of the retrograde, could either be retracted or revisited or having to be done over in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like that. Like just maybe, yeah, maybe it is just kind of bringing in more people or viewpoints and inviting like different, like, so there's more conversations or perhaps more ideas on like how to tackle all the things Mars and Gemini wants to do.
Yeah, it feels like Mercury and Libra would be like that. Like, let's all sit down and talk about this like civilized people, it feels like that would be like that voice in the room.
Exactly.
So, and that might, we might have to try it a few times before it gets us where we want to go. Moving towards, again, we're almost at the end of August. On the 27th, we have, again, this lunation with a lot of other things also simultaneously happening on this day. We have the new moon in Virgo, Venus will square Uranus, and then the sun also squares Mars, or that square perfects. And so again, it feels a little bit hard to really isolate the lunation for me because there's just so many other things that are a little bit entangled in what is happening there. The biggest thing that jumps out at me is I feel like, we have this Mars and Gemini transit. The sun is squaring Uranus with this new moon. It feels like this new moon is going to give us a pretty big hint about some of the things we'll be carrying and growing and working with and working through during that Mars and Gemini transit, because I think the full moon in Virgo will be happening just before Mars leaves Gemini. So it feels like there's also this thing that's gestating and growing and this story that's going on sort of simultaneously with that Mars and Gemini transit, and we might start to get like a seed of what that might be.
Yeah, this one is a doozy. I also have a hard time. Maybe with this one, I'll start with just how I summarize it, and then I'll break down like the little things that are going on, the big things that are going on all at once. But I think this new moon will bring the usual urge that new moons bring, which is trying new things, like mastering an existing thing, maybe launching a new project. But I think especially so the kind of stuff that is challenging, competitive, requires a lot of energy and action. I would just very much watch out for impulsivity as well as burnout. Again, even when we were talking earlier about that Mercury-Jupiter opposition, like the overpromising, I think there's some danger for that here. Because of Venus and Leo squaring Uranus and opposing Saturn. So now Venus is like in this this fixed signs party, right? And it's really kind of coming to a head on the 27th at the same time as this new moon. When it comes to the Venusian things like relationships or creative work, I see this as where that tension between like intimacy and security versus freedom, like it's going to really come into head here. So if there are things like around relationships that you're thinking about initiating like during this time, I would just look like if there's certain relationships that need to end during this time, just really view it as like when it comes to relationships, endings really are new beginnings too. Or on the flip side, if there are relationships that need to solidify or need to be redefined, that's also a new beginning. And so I could see that potentially coming up with this the Venus here as well. And then just Mars, you also mentioned Mars and Gemini is going to be squaring that sun in Virgo. And so when I think of a sun Mars square, I mean, these are both planets, just a lot of energy and vitality. And so when I think of that square, I just think of just like like that spark or combustion that makes like engines run, right? I just think of just like a lot of heat and a lot of energy, and I could see this being channeled in really good ways through this new moon. Like I could just see a lot of passion and competitiveness here, but I could also just see very much like burnout and rash behavior.
Yeah, it feels that sun square, it feels like kind of a battle of the wills a little bit, because the sun is kind of like a lot of ways like this willpower, and Mars also being in a lot of these like vigorous exchanges around that. And yeah, I agree with all the things that you're saying. I think that it has this new moon and they have a lot of tension to it. It's like, if you look at the chart for the moon, everything just feels very taut. All the strings feel very pulled and like stretched. And like maybe the moon in Virgo normally kind of wants to move around a little bit, but it's sort of like caged a little bit. And Venus square Uranus, it's like, Venus moving through Leo may tend to have more of like that confidence in its unique flair, but it being challenged by that disruption of Uranus, something that is unshakable gets shaken. And sometimes again, and Uranus is not a malefic. It's not to say just because it gets shaken, it's bad, right? But it can be sometimes destabilized. Things that we take for granted are fixed. Things that we take for granted are sure and dependable. They get kind of disturbed or unsettled. And those are things that we just really have to be present for.
I think, yeah, along with all those transits we just mentioned, like that Mercury entering Libra, and then now like opposing Jupiter is all still very close to. I mean, that's only just a couple days, like right before this new moon happens, that Mercury enters Libra. So it's like everything happening. It's like cardinal signs, big signs, mutable signs. There's a lot of squares and a lot of. So I think it's exactly like you said. Like everything just kind of feels like really, really taut. I think if I'm thinking correctly, I think everything disposits back to that Mercury in Libra. Like everything is just like so mercurial with this chart too. If I'm like really thinking about, because that Mars and that Sun are ruled by that Mercury. And then there's this new moon that's in Virgo. And then even this like Venus in Leo is gonna be ruled by a Sun in Virgo, which is then ruled by Mercury in Libra. So I think that's also just something to note.
Yeah, again, bringing us back to the, like, are there ways that we're also trying to like sort of stand in the gap and like mediate or advocate for, and like, are there ways we can do that potentially with more grace than we would otherwise think if Mercury was in something that was more harsh, I think, than Libra, or at least hopefully. My hope is that.
Yeah, I agree. It feels a lot less explosive than the full moon.
Oh, for sure.
That happens earlier in the month. Like I do see like this could be a new moon where it's like, okay, like rather than trying to bust down walls, let's like try to figure out how do we rebuild this wall together. And maybe there will be a lot of just clashes and just some arguments along the way, but at the end of the day it all comes back to like, okay, how do we build what we want to build?
Yeah, totally. And how do we, like, what do you need from me, what do I need from you, these kind of conversations around like, equity and grace and compromise and mediation. Like, what are the things that we both need to give up? What are the things that we both need, both parties, both people, whatever. And again, still having more of a relationship like this, at least an impulse towards relationship and connection because of that Mercury in Libra, than maybe we could expect otherwise. And then we get to move to Venus's, we kind of drop off of August with Venus's final squeeze, Venus opposing Saturn on August 28th. And you've already talked about this sort of Leo, Aquarius sort of opposition, how these signs sort of by nature of their placement and their relationship to one another sort of represent very different things and opposite sides of the spectrum due to their opposed nature. This, the individual versus the collective is something that you brought up. This Leo, the creative or desire for innovation and autonomy and like specialness. I feel like, Leo is like our unique snowflake, versus the Saturn and Aquarius, like no one is special. Like, it's sort of like, what is it was like egality, which I'm all for, like equity and all that. But it's like, if we take egalitarian to like a non-healthy place where it's like, no one's special. And there's that. And I also think too, Kim Stanley Robinson has this book titled The Ministry of the Future. And I just keep thinking about that title as it relates to Saturn and Aquarius, take it or leave it. But I'll pause there. What do you think about Venus opposing Saturn? You've already talked about it a little bit, but.
I'm glad you bring back up just the Leo Aquarius axis and just the differences in it. And I think it's a very different flavor too when you're looking at Venus and Saturn in opposition, because these are two different planets as well. Sure. Venus, it's like you said, Venus wants like comfort and connection and Venus wants to feel special too.
And can we all just get along?
Exactly. I have Venus in Leo natally too, so I know the struggle. But whereas, yeah, Saturn is a colder planet where, like you said, like Saturn to an extreme can very much be like no one's special. Like we're all just blips in the grand scheme of the universe. And you're like, okay. But in their differences, like I also do think there's some complement with Venus and Saturn, and even looking to Libra is, I think, an excellent place, a way to look at it, where Libra is ruled by Venus, but Saturn is exalted there.
Oh, yeah.
And it just makes me think a lot about, again, with relationships, again, whether these are romantic, platonic, or even business relationships, every single one of us seeks commitment and stability and security in our relationships. And yet we also seek individuality and freedom and expression in them as well. And so I think that's what I think of a lot when I think of that Venus Saturn like tension, and when they're in opposition with each other, I could see those themes very well coming up, not just in relationships too, again, creative expression, like anything Venusian. But yeah, I do think when you think about like, oh, how do you find the balance between those things, like I feel like the archetype and the sign of Libra is like a good way of looking at it too.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that, maybe bringing up some themes too is something that I was thinking, talking about this sort of this priority of self-expression, especially in Leo, but then, Saturn being more of like, well, censorship, or what is censorship and what is just waiting for the appropriate time and place. Right. And like those, we may tend to perceive something as censorship when actually it's just like, it's not the right time. Or, and thinking of that Saturn and exalted in Libra, it's like sometimes we have to give up things for the sake of connection, for the sake of peace. And that's not always a bad thing. Yeah. And so thinking about, either it could be perceived as like some kind of overpowering responsibility or commitment that's asked of us, or we feel like, oh, that's cramping my style. Or it could also just be something that's like, no, like the Uranus square Venus was like, no, we had to undo this a little bit. And now it's like, we can really thoughtfully, perhaps with some tension, come to a place where we can collectively together honor the individual, honor the whole, whatever that is the group, and put something together that can ultimately serve both.
Yeah. And the other word I think of when I think of Saturn is boundaries. And
Sure.
I think in every single type of like interpersonal interaction or relationship, boundaries are very, very important and can be very, very conducive to really healthy relationships, commitments, intimacy. So yeah.
For sure. Yeah, I think we'll get a lot of opportunities to investigate what those authentic boundaries, maybe that's a good Leo really making sure that they're authentic and true to self, and Saturn making sure that they're actually boundaries.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, that takes us to the end of August, which feels like a feat. Is there anything else that you want to throw in for the month before we wrap up?
No, I think that about covers it. I really enjoyed like having this discussion with you. It actually makes me feel a lot better about the transits of August. Like I feel like I know it's coming now, and I hope others who are listening to this feel the same way.
Totally. It's like at the very least, we can just know what's coming, and that can be really helpful. Where can people find what's your, remind us of your Twitter handles? Where can people stalk you on the internet, find out more about you and what you're up to? Do you have anything coming up that you want people to know about?
Yeah, so folks can find me on Twitter and Instagram, and my website. It's all the same username. It's Pao Astrology, so that's spelled Pao Astrology. And in terms of anything coming up, as I said, my readings are not open yet, but you can go on my website and get on my mailing list if you want to be the first to know if and when I do reopen them. But end of August, I will be going to ISAR. I never know how to pronounce it. Is it ISAR? Is it ISAR? The conference is going to be my very first like in-person astrology conference ever. So if you all are there, definitely like come say hi. I'm always down to meet like other astrologers, but that's end of August. That is really funny to think of now that we've just recapped the transits, like what transits are happening while like this conference is happening. So
For sure. For sure. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you being our first kind of guest forecast person. It's been really, really fun for me and such a pleasure to have you on, and I hope we get to do it again.
awesome. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I can't believe I'm the first one. But I will let people know I did claim August because it's the same month. So.
You did. Thank you so much for joining us today. And as is our custom, we will wrap up the forecast with a poem. And this is a short poem by James Baldwin, and it is untitled. Lord, when you send the rain, think about it, please, a little. Do not get carried away by the sound of falling water, the marvelous light on the falling water. I am beneath that water. It falls with great force, and the light blinds me to the light.